The story begins on an afternoon. Before exhuming a grave, the feng shui master would usually take a handful of soil from the surrounding area. He would then taste the soil. If the taste was normal, Mr. Kim would agree to help the client's family open the coffin. However, today, old Kim seemed to have encountered something untouchable. He tasted the soil around the grave, and his expression immediately became grave. When he looked up, he noticed the tombstone had no name on it. Upon closer inspection, he saw a row of small symbols in the bottom left corner. He then stood at the head of the grave, gazing into the distance, and his unease intensified. He asked the homeowner who chose this burial site for your grandfather. The homeowner replied, "My grandfather was a significant figure during World War II. A fox shaman selected this feng shui spot for my grandfather." Due to the rampant grave robbing back then, the shaman decided not to engrave a name on the tombstone. The homeowner's explanation sounded reasonable, but Mr. Kim still felt uneasy. He decided to abandon the job, which greatly angered his associates. The homeowner had offered a high price, enough for the whole group to retire after completing this job. Thus, they had to find a way to convince Mr. Kim. Recalling his unusual intuition, Mr. Kim said, "In my 35 years as a feng shui master, I've never encountered a sight as ominous as this. From the moment I set foot on the mountain, I felt the entire place shrouded in yin energy. I even saw a fox spirit around the grave, which is highly unusual. Koreans believe that areas with fox spirits are unsuitable for burials. I think this site isn't for burying the dead, but for cultivating restless spirits. If you insist on exhuming this grave, it could cost lives." Despite this warning, Mr. Kim's associates were unwilling to give up the opportunity for wealth. They met with the homeowner to discuss further and learned about the family's plight. After the grandfather passed away, strange occurrences began in the household. The homeowner's father became paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. His elder brother suffered from mental illness and eventually took his own life. Previously, the family had invited many feng shui masters, but none dared to touch the grave. They emigrated to the US, hoping that being far away from the grave would bring peace. But misfortunes continued to haunt them. The homeowner's wife suffered a miscarriage for unexplained reasons. Their current child had cried incessantly since birth. Even the best hospitals in the US could not find the cause. The homeowner contacted Wei Rim, a female shaman capable of communicating with spirits. Upon seeing the child, Wei Rim realized that the family's ancestral spirit was troubled. She believed the homeowner's grandfather's soul was in torment, causing harm to the descendants. As she wasn't well versed in exhuming graves, she suggested collaborating with Mr. Kim and Dong-gil. After hearing the entire story, Mr. Kim no longer held back. He said the symbols on the tombstone are coordinates of the grave. If the fox shaman chose this location, he must have intended to hide some secret here. Upon hearing the homeowner's story, Mr. Kim became even more reluctant to take the job. While everyone remained silent, Wei Rim proposed what was considered the best solution at the time: to perform the exhumation ritual and the soul-calling ritual simultaneously. Mr. Kim prepared all the sacrificial items requested by Wei Rim. Wei Rim asked for 5 people born in the year of the pig to dig the grave. Dong-gil smeared horse blood on their foreheads. Then he cut a small bunch of their hair and placed it in the sacrificial pig's mouth. This was done to divert the spirit's attention from the diggers to the pig. Wei Rim used her shamanistic rituals to ward off evil spirits. When everything was ready, the head of the ceremony stood in front of the grave and delivered a memorial speech. Dong-gil sat nearby, chanting incantations while beating a drum. Wei Rim cut her thigh with a knife, then placed her hand into a fire urn and smeared ash on her face. Next, she stabbed her own neck several times but emerged unscathed, proving she was under divine protection. The homeowner struck the grave with a spade a few times, officially commencing the exhumation. As the diggers worked, Wei Rim continuously stabbed and slashed 5 sacrificial pigs. This was intended to protect the diggers from being targeted by malevolent entities. Mr. Kim, filled with anxiety, kept his eyes fixed on the grave. He feared that something uncontrollable might happen. After about half an hour, the diggers finally reached the wooden coffin. Mr. Kim and Yong-gun descended, immediately feeling a chilling cold envelop their bodies. They brushed off the dirt covering the coffin and uncovered a red cloth draped over it. While others noticed nothing unusual, Mr. Kim quickly recognized the situation. With his experience, he identified this as a Japanese burial practice. The red cloth bore the title and identity of the homeowner's grandfather. At that moment, Mr. Kim realized why the homeowner was willing to spend so much money on the exhumation. It turned out that the grandfather was not a Korean War hero but a traitor who sided with the Japanese fascists. This also explained why the tombstone bore no name. Pulling back the red cloth, they discovered the coffin was made of cypress wood, a material once reserved exclusively for royalty and aristocrats. The entire exhumation process went smoothly, without any abnormalities. This reassured Mr. Kim somewhat. When the coffin was brought out, Mr. Kim tossed a coin engraved with the image of a great general into the grave. This coin was meant to suppress the spirit. As the group left, Yong-gun reminded everyone not to eat meat that day. Afterward, they loaded the coffin onto a vehicle and prepared to leave the graveyard. However, as soon as they departed, the diggers began excavating the surrounding area. Hoping to find valuable burial items, they continued digging. While digging, a red and black snake suddenly emerged from the ground. The snake's head bore the face of a long-haired woman. Terrified, one of the diggers struck the snake with a spade, cutting it in half. The snake let out a harrowing scream that echoed across the mountain. Only Warren heard this eerie cry, but she didn't know what had happened. Looking up, she saw the previously clear blue sky suddenly shrouded in dark clouds. Strong winds began to blow, signaling ominous events ahead. As the vehicle carrying the coffin descended the mountain, a heavy rainstorm began. In Korean beliefs, cremating during rain is considered bad luck. It is thought to prevent the deceased spirit from reincarnating into a good family. Mr. Kim suggested storing the coffin in a hospital morgue until the weather cleared for cremation. The homeowner, though eager for immediate cremation, didn't want to harm his grandfather and agreed. Thanks to Yong-bin's connections, they found a nearby private hospital. He bribed the staff to temporarily store the coffin in the morgue. Knowing the coffin hadn't been opened, the staff member grew greedy. While everyone was out for a meal, he secretly attempted to pry open the coffin lid. Such an extravagant coffin must surely contain valuable items inside. But just as the coffin lid was pried open slightly, Warren and Bong-gil suddenly rushed in. They immediately stopped the person, but it was already too late. The spirit of the homeowner's grandfather escaped from the coffin, full of resentment. The intense hatred was so strong that Warren fainted on the spot. At the same time, in the US, the homeowner's father heard his father's voice calling to him. "My son, open the door for me." When he opened the door, a cold wind swept into the room. He heard eating sounds at the dining table, followed by the chill behind him. "You all enjoy the wealth I left behind while I remain cold and starving." The grandfather grabbed his son from behind and plunged his hand into his chest. He crushed his son's heart. Meanwhile, the man's wife was dancing to music in the room. The grandfather entered, danced with his daughter-in-law for a moment, then pushed her to the floor and strangled her until she stopped breathing. Warren woke up from her fainting spell, blood dripping from her nose, but not seriously injured. She knew the spirit of the grandfather would continue to harm the family descendants. She urged Mr. Kim to protect the homeowner currently in Korea. Warren and Bong-gil returned to the morgue to handle the spirit. She handed Bong-gil a pine branch to act as bait for the spirit. When the spirit possessed Bong-gil, Yong-gun would tighten the ropes to restrain it. Warren began drumming and chanting the shaman's summoning ritual. Soon, the pine branch in Bong-gil's hand fell to the ground. This indicated that the spirit had entered Bong-gil. They began conversing with the spirit. "Release your anger. Why are you so resentful? Share your grievances with us." The spirit replied, "I want to reunite with my descendants. I want to take them with me." Worm objected that is not allowed. At that moment, Bong-gil vomited, signifying the failure of Warren's summoning ritual. Meanwhile, Mr. Kim arrived at the homeowner's hotel room. He noticed the homeowner behaving oddly, having consumed 10 bottles of water. Mr. Kim said, "Your grandfather's coffin has been opened." But the homeowner kept repeating a strange phrase, "The fox bites through the tiger's waist." Mr. Kim was shocked and asked, "What do you mean?" The homeowner kept repeating in Japanese, "The fox bites through the tiger's waist." At that moment, Mr. Kim realized the grandfather's spirit had come for him. While Mr. Kim tried to analyze the phrase's meaning, the homeowner's neck twisted 180 degrees. With a cracking sound, the young homeowner died instantly. Seeing everything spiraling out of control, Mr. Kim no longer cared about the rain. He immediately ordered everyone to cremate the coffin. He instructed the homeowner's caretaker to contact the parents in the US for cremation permission. However, the homeowner's parents had also died, leaving no one to consult. Fortunately, the homeowner's aunt was still alive and unharmed. After learning that her grandson was killed by the spirit, she promptly agreed to the cremation. At the same time, the grandfather's spirit arrived at the hospital room of his great-grandchild to cause harm. He placed his hand on the baby's chest, causing vital signs on the monitor to fluctuate wildly. But as the coffin in Korea began cremation, the malevolent spirit dissipated. Shortly afterward, the child stopped crying and returned to normal. Mr. Kim thought it was all over, but something even more terrifying awaited. The gravedigger who had killed the red and black snake developed a strange illness. He went to the hospital for tests, which came back normal, but blood continually seeped from the corners of his eyes. With his wealth of experience, Mr. Kim investigated the matter immediately. He discovered that the snake was known as the water serpent woman in Japanese folklore. Anyone who touched it would fall severely ill or suffer grave misfortune. Mr. Kim decided to find the snake's body so Woo-rim could perform the exorcism ritual. Only then could the gravedigger's life be saved. As he continued digging, his shovel struck something hard. When he dug further, he discovered another coffin beneath. Although he had seen shared graves before, the way this coffin was buried was very unusual. The lower coffin was buried vertically, something Mr. Kim had never encountered before. He immediately called his teammates for assistance. When they had dug halfway, they noticed the exterior of the coffin was covered in barbed steel. It was unclear whether this was to deter grave robbers or to keep something inside from escaping. More disturbingly, the coffin was nearly 3 meters long, much larger than normal. Although the coffin was peculiar, the sun was setting, and they couldn't continue their investigations. They hurriedly carried the coffin down the mountain. On their way, they found a small temple and brought the coffin there. The temple's master, upon receiving offerings from Mr. Kim, agreed to store the coffin in a warehouse. To prevent any unexpected incidents, Woo-rim scattered rice around the coffin and poured horse blood to create a strict protective barrier. When the homeowner's aunt arrived at the temple, she was also puzzled by the additional coffin found beneath her father's grave. Under Mr. Kim's questioning, she produced a photograph of her father with some Japanese men. She explained that the person who had chosen her father's burial site was a Japanese feng shui master known as the Fox. Hearing this, Mr. Kim immediately recalled the last words of a homeowner before his death. The fox bites through the tiger's waist. Now understanding that the fox was a feng shui master, he wondered what the tiger's waist referred to. The aunt admitted she knew no more than that. Before leaving, she requested Mr. Kim to handle the strange coffin. "I will cover the expenses on behalf of my nephew," she said. Afterward, Mr. Kim's team began the exorcism ritual for the snake. They planned to cremate the coffin the following morning. During dinner, the temple master shared an old story with Mr. Kim. Long ago, this place had been visited by a group of grave robbers. Their target was the anonymous graves atop the mountain. Even though the grave was unusual, Mr. Kim decided not to overthink it. He planned to deal with the coffin the next day and leave immediately. But while everyone was asleep, Bong-gil had a nightmare. He dreamt of the temple master standing on top of him, repeatedly lamenting. "My organs were taken by a monster." The master cried out. Realizing he was being attacked by an evil spirit, Bong-gil drew a talisman to dispel it. Feeling uneasy, he went to find the temple master but didn't see him in his room. Sensing something was wrong, he immediately woke Woo-rim, who was sleeping in the car. As Woo-rim prepared to get up, her grandmother's spirit held her hand back. "It's dangerous outside, you mustn't go," her grandmother warned. Woo-rim's grandmother, a shaman herself, had always protected her. But Woo-rim couldn't let Bong-gil face danger alone, so she decided to accompany him. When the two arrived at the warehouse, they found the coffin had been opened. Marks on the ceiling indicated that whatever was inside had burst through to escape. Nearby, they discovered the lifeless body of the temple master. Woo-rim instructed Bong-gil to wake Mr. Kim and everyone else immediately. She stayed behind to investigate what had happened. Inside the coffin, Woo-rim found an ancient helmet. As she glanced toward the door, she noticed a dark shadow lingering outside. Stepping cautiously, she was startled to see a figure over 2 meters tall standing in the doorway. At the same time, a voice boomed. "A human? I've come to retrieve my helmet." Woo-rim hastily responded, No, I'm not human. I am your servant." "Is that so? Have you prepared fish and melons for me? Didn't you follow the Lord's orders?" "I've already slain the enemy general." Terrified, Woo-rim tried to placate him. "I've prepared fish for you." Despite speaking in Japanese, the malevolent spirit realized she was human. Standing atop the roof, he shouted loudly, "You're human." Recognizing the danger, Woo-rim panicked and fled outside. Hearing the commotion, Bong-gil rushed in and stabbed the malevolent spirit with an iron rod. But with his armored body and massive size, the malevolent spirit remained unharmed. "Run, get out of here," Bong-gil shouted as he tried to block the malevolent spirit's path. The malevolent spirit overpowered him and plunged a hand into his abdomen. When the malevolent spirit turned toward Woo-rim, the light from a nearby Buddhist stupa caught his attention. He turned back, clasped his hands before the stupa, and began chanting prayers. Moments later, his body ignited, transforming into a ball of fire. When Mr. Kim and Yong-gun arrived, they were stunned by the scene before them. The malevolent spirit, now a fiery orb, circled the sky as if searching for its home. After a few rounds, the fireball flew toward a specific direction. Seeing Bong-gil on the brink of death, they rushed him to the hospital. Although doctors managed to save his life, his internal organs and spine had suffered severe damage. He had to remain hospitalized for continued monitoring and awaited a final prognosis. Upon hearing the term spine, Mr. Kim recalled a mural he'd seen at the temple. The mural depicted the Korean peninsula split by the 38th parallel, also referred to as the spine. Remembering this, Mr. Kim realized something significant. He immediately drove back to the temple to search for clues. After rummaging around, he discovered a feng shui journal in a drawer. Upon examining it, he found a photograph of a group labeled grave robbers. The journal revealed that this group wasn't grave robbers but patriotic feng shui masters. Mr. Kim finally understood the true meaning of the phrase, "The fox bites through the tiger's waist." He decided to return to the mountain grave to search for the iron stake or related items. While digging, he was horrified to discover that the malevolent spirit had returned. Fortunately, the sunlight rendered the spirit powerless at that moment. Upon returning, Mr. Kim discussed his findings with the group. He explained that before the Korean peninsula was divided, its shape resembled a tiger. The grave's location was right at the waist of the tiger. The Japanese feng shui master, known as the fox, had driven an iron stake into the spot. The purpose was to destroy the destiny of the entire Korean peninsula. This was the meaning behind the phrase, "The fox bites through the tiger's waist." The patriotic feng shui masters realized this scheme and took refuge at the nearby temple. They awaited an opportunity to remove the iron stake and break the curse. The malevolent spirit was created to guard the stake and prevent anyone from removing it. Mr. Kim believed that if the stake wasn't removed, the fate of both Korea and the peninsula would collapse. He declared, for the future generations, we must remove this cursed iron stake. If successful, the malevolent spirit would also be destroyed. Seeing Mr. Kim's determination, Worim and Yonggun, after much internal conflict, agreed to help. Worim mentioned that while defeating the malevolent spirit was impossible, she had a way to stall it temporarily. For safety, she inscribed protective scriptures on everyone's bodies to ward off attacks from the malevolent spirit. By the time everyone reached the mountain, night had fallen. They scattered fish that the malevolent spirit liked to eat along the path leading to an ancient tree. At Tuemi, a large hand emerged from the ground, picking up each fish and putting it into its mouth. Worim immediately ignited the piles of dry grass she had prepared and stuffed them into the tree's roots. White smoke enveloped the area around the tree. The malevolent spirit arrived, realizing his helmet was missing from the temple. He heard a voice echo, "My mountain is lively tonight, isn't it?" The malevolent spirit asked, "Is this mountain yours?" The voice replied, "That's right. This is my mountain." The malevolent spirit, puzzled, asked, "Then why don't I hear the sounds of gunfire and swords?" Worim calmly responded, "That's because the war is over." The malevolent spirit roared, "No, our battle is not over yet." At that moment, Mr. Kim and Yonggun jumped into the grave, starting to dig for the iron stake. Worim continued to converse with the malevolent spirit and learned he was a general from World War II. After the general had fallen in battle, the fox took his body along with those of other officers and stitched them together. He drove a long sword through the body and sewed the general's head onto it. Finally, he cast spells over the body, transforming the general into the strongest malevolent spirit in Japan. The fox buried the malevolent spirit with a sword to erode the destiny of the Korean peninsula gradually. The iron stake that Mr. Kim was searching for turned out to be the sword hidden inside the malevolent spirit. The burial of the homeowner's grandfather was merely a diversion by the fox. After digging for more than half an hour without finding the stake, Yonggun decided to step outside to check if Worim was in danger. Meanwhile, Mr. Kim persevered with the digging. At the same time, the malevolent spirit realized that Worim had exceeded her time limit. Just as Worim thought her life was at an end, her grandmother's spirit appeared behind her. With her grandmother's help, Worim narrowly escaped the danger. The two spirits began battling each other, but the malevolent spirit quickly realized someone was in the grave. He roared furiously, transforming into a fireball, and flew into the sky. Yonggun and Worim panicked and immediately ran toward the grave. At this moment, Mr. Kim continued to dig and saw the fireball in the sky. Frozen in fear, he couldn't move even as Yonggun shouted at him. The fireball shot straight into the grave, accompanied by a voice. "Do you want to become my servant, or will you offer me your heart and liver? I've memorized the scriptures on your body. I've guarded this fire for 500 years. Before Mr. Kim could react, the malevolent spirit plunged its finger into his abdomen. Seeing this, Worim decisively poured the prepared horse blood onto the malevolent spirit. The blood caused the malevolent spirit to emit smoke and retreat. However, Worim didn't realize that the blood only wounded the malevolent spirit, not kill it. As they were checking Mr. Kim's wound, the malevolent spirit suddenly attacked from behind. It effortlessly lifted all three of them like they were mere chickens. In desperation, Warren shouted, "The iron stake is inside the malevolent spirit." Hearing this, Mr. Kim immediately understood the situation. If the malevolent spirit was the cursed iron stake, it belonged to the metal element. According to Feng Shui, wood overcomes metal. Mr. Kim picked up a wooden rod and stabbed it into the malevolent spirit's leg. The malevolent spirit screamed in agony, confirming Mr. Kim's theory was correct. Yonggun grabbed another tool and repeatedly struck the malevolent spirit. But that doesn't do much good. Realizing the malevolent spirit could transform into a fireball, Mr. Kim deduced it also had a metal element. Following the 5 elements principle, metal generates fire, so wood containing water was needed to subdue it. Mr. Kim smeared horse blood on the wooden rod and slashed it at the malevolent spirit. The malevolent spirit howled in pain and began to disintegrate as Mr. Kim dealt a decisive blow. Seizing the moment of weakness, he mustered all his strength and struck one final fatal blow. The malevolent spirit was split into 2 halves and completely destroyed. Mr. Kim's bravery and quick thinking earned him the respect of Warren and Yonggun. With the ordeal over, Mr. Kim was rushed to the hospital and survived. He became friends with Bong Gil in the hospital as they both recovered. The mysterious deaths over the past few days were attributed to wild bears by the police. Thank you for watching this film. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Goodbye and see you again.